Okay, so I'm here once again with the modern age of comics. As I already mentioned in the beginning, people today usually tend to talk about four comic book ages, and out of those four, the modern age is the last one. And if you ask a person, they're most likely going to say that right now we are still in the modern age of comics, which is bullshit. I'm sorry, but this is okay. So yeah, the point here is that the modern age, which very nicely has a very neat starting point, and that is 1986. So it would mean that the modern age would be an ongoing era of comics for nearly 35 years. But even in the last 10 to 5 years, there have been so many changes, so many significant changes, both in how comics represent their characters and how comics are represented in popular culture, that we just cannot say that we are still in the same comic book era. But that's for later on, when I'm going to talk about what is currently going on in comics and what I call the fifth era of comics. But now let's talk about the modern age of comics itself. As I've mentioned, it has a neat starting point, 86, which saw the publication of two limited series meaning that when the first issue was published, it was already set how long the story was going to last, and it's not a continuous storyline, but uh, a completely round and finished story by themselves. Both of these stories were published by DC Comics, and the first is Watchmen, written by Alan Moore, and the second is The Dark Knight Returns, written by Frank Miller. The Watchmen takes place outside of the general DC continuity, while The Dark Knight Returns, which is a Batman story, takes place within the universe but is considered to be an alternative universe, basically. What is the same about these stories? They are dark. It's actually this tone, this characteristic that the whole modern age seems to have is called dark and gritty realism. Remember this phrase, dark and gritty realism, which is of course not realism. It basically means that these comics have a very violent, very dark and kind of depressing tone, but at the same time they tend to, or at least like to, focus on more philosophical questions, more moral dilemmas, which makes them interesting and which makes them pretty much relevant and actual literature. We don't like to think of comics as actual literature, but especially Watchmen, that is literature. That doesn't mean that I like them. I mean, I like Watchmen, but I hate Dark Knight Rises. This is Dark Knight Returns. This is something like I was once giving a presentation at a geek event about the comic book eras, and I was talking about how important the Dark Knight Return is. And then after the event, I was talking with some of the guys who was in the audience, and I was telling, oh my god, I hate Dark Knight Returns so much. And one of the guys was, but you said it was important. Yes, it is very significant. It set the tone of a whole era, but I hate it. It's an old Batman lamenting about how old he is. It's bad. I mean, it's bad for me. I hate Batman. Anyway, so yeah, the dark and gritty realism, the hard questions, the moral grayness. Because okay, let's talk a little bit about what these stories are and what moral questions they are trying to talk about. For example, in Watchmen, one of the characters actually kills a superhero, a masked vigilante, not really a superhero, masked vigilante first, and then kills off like quarter of New York or half of New York City, 2 million people, if I remember well, because here's the catch: he stages it as an alien attack and basically makes the whole world unite against this perceived threat, and this way he prevents a global war, a global atomic war. So here's the question: is it okay to kill people to prevent something worse happening? At the same time, The Dark Knight Returns is about Batman who retired and comes back from retirement after like 10 years. And while he was retired, the Joker already slinked back into the shadows. And the return of Batman actually sparks the return of the Joker and other unsavory figures basically in Gotham. So the question here is whether the presence of a superhero draws after himself the presence of of the supervillain. Okay, that was a really messed up sentence, but you get what I mean. So the presence of the superhero sparks the presence of the supervillain, which are really good questions, and the stories are really interesting. And there is a reason why we see those as the beginnings, the cornerstones of the modern age of comics. But at the same time, I believe that on the long run, these stories actually hurt comics, because what they started actually became escalated later on as time went on, and comics really became this hyper masculine, hyper violent, uh, very misogynistic stories. Once again, this is the time of the comic book stores, of comics being a fringe interest, a subculture. This is what sparked this idea of the socially awkward, unkept comic book reader guy who is completely lost in the stories. So yeah, once again, the start of the modern age of comics actually hurt comics on the long run. I believe that it hurt comics on the long run. So yeah, you get the hard moral question, the interesting storylines, but you also get the dark and gritty realism, the violence, and the more and more violent art as well. Uh, because the modern age, and especially the early 90s, saw the rise of the so-called image house style or bad girl style art. Just one comment: when you're reading this week, set reading the Deadpool story, when you are presented with the chance to choose the anatomy book, please choose the anatomy book. Believe me, choose the anatomy book. So what is this image house style of art? So what happened basically is that by the early 90s, Marvel had some star artists. By star artist, I mean that what they drew became more important what was actually happening in the story. People were more interested in the visual part of the comics than the narrative part. Such star artists were like, for example, Jim Lee. And they wanted a bigger slice from the comic book cake. They wanted to be allowed to write stories and to have more creative power over the stories. Marvel didn't like that, so these artists left Marvel and started their own company, Image Comics. Now, Image Comics is still an ongoing venture, and right now it's like the third comic book company. What is a big difference between Image and Marvel and DC is that if you write a character for Marvel or DC, the rights to that character belong to the company. But if you publish something in with Image, the rights belong to you and you alone. You keep the rights to the characters. Image also doesn't really focus on superheroes. They publish all kinds of stories. For example, remember that cat comic that looked like a magazine that I brought you once? Now that is an Image Comics publication. So yeah, but in the beginning, when it was first established, basically all the stories that they did were just copies of stories from Marvel and DC, like a copycat X-Men and stuff like that. Because even though the artists were good at drawing and their art, which I think is actually ugly, but that's my opinion, uh, they were good at art, but they were bad at storytelling. So yeah, that's about Image Comics. How does this art look like? The men are hyper muscular and hyper masculine, very violent, with huge muscles, like anatomically completely crazy, huge muscles. The women has have big hair and big boobs, big butts, tiny waists. Uh, they are basically sex dolls. This is also something that we are going to talk about when we talk about sexism in comics. But yeah, that was the Image house style. So yeah, that's basically what I wanted to tell you about the modern age. Uh, so it's dark and gritty. It's violent. It objectifies the characters, especially women. It's dark. It's depressing. And it went on for a long time. And some people still say that the modern age of comics is still ongoing, which is bullshit, and I'm going to tell you in the next segment of why is it bullshit.